Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name's Meredith E. Phillips, and today my video is part of a huge collaboration that is going to introduce you to a variety of genres. This entire project was organized and headed by Nicole Wilbur. I know I've mentioned her a bunch of times on this channel before, but if you've not for some reason gone to her channel, I'll link her below. She's amazing. Definitely go check her out. Also linked below is going to be a huge playlist with a bunch of other videos from other author tubers who are sharing their expertise on various genres. So please do go check that out, especially if maybe this genre isn't the one for you. There's definitely going to be one that will hopefully pique your interest in that playlist. So go check those out, please. We are here at the end of 2023, and maybe you're thinking of embarking on a different kind of project for yourself in the new year. And if that's the case, this is perhaps the video for you. We're going to be chatting today about historical romance because that is what I write. I'm going to share a little bit with you about what that genre is exactly, some different resources that you might be able to utilize if you're looking into writing a story in that genre yourself, and some different tips and tricks to help you along your way. So first and foremost, let's just start with a definition of what historical romance is, what that includes. Of course, historical romance is sort of a subgenre under the wider romance category. There's a little bit of debate in the community over when historical begins, but generally speaking, I think most people at this point agree anything World War II or prior is going to be in the historic category. Now, when we talk about historical romance, I think a lot of people, maybe not, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of people though tend to picture like 1800s England times, right? But of course, historical can encompass a whole bunch of different eras, a whole bunch of different countries. So Westerns are historical romance. If you have a story set in ancient China, that's a historical romance. Set in ancient Greece or Rome, those are historical romance. You've got medieval, you've got Vikings, you've got anything prior to World War II in any place around the globe is going to be historical romance. Now you might be asking, well, what about stories set in like the 1960s or the 1980s? Those are a little bit like, where do you put them? They're not contemporary romance, certainly. But are they old enough to be historical? Are people going to look at that as historic? Some people have the audacity to suggest that stories set in the 1990s are historic, which is weird because that was only 10 years ago. Honestly, there's not really a whole lot of writers writing romances set in those decades, so it hasn't become like a huge problem yet. I don't know. I mean, I guess technically they would be historical romance. But again, there's not really a whole lot being written in that time period. Most people are choosing to write something old enough that everyone is going to consider it historical. Since these stories are part of the overall romance genre, they need to fit the two main requirements of a romance story. First of all, the love story should be the primary part of the main plot. This is not a subplot. This is not a little thing happening on the side. It's the main part of the story. And second of all, this is somehow kind of debated sometimes. I don't understand why, but the second thing that a romance novel must have is a happy ending. If one of the main characters dies or the main couple breaks up at the end of the book, you have not written a romance. You've written maybe a love story, you've maybe written some literary fiction or some women's fiction, but you haven't written a romance. The key for any romance novel of any subgenre is that it must have a happy ending. So let me share a little bit about my own personal journey into this genre and why I love it so much. So for me, I am writing stories set during the Regency period in England. The Regency period, technically speaking, is a very small period of time from 1811 until 1820. The Regency is part of the Georgian era, which is a longer period of time that took place from 1714 all the way through about 1830. There's a little bit of, kind of fudging of those numbers. Some people say it goes a little bit longer. Some people say no, 1830 is the hard and fast deadline. This was the time when you have all the King Georges in England, okay? So there's this bigger time period, and then you have the Regency, which is right tiny little bit in the middle. This is when Jane Austen is writing all of her work and when all of her books take place. And to this day, it's still a very popular time in which to place a novel. So why is this time period so engaging? I think obviously we have romanticized the period. There's definitely a lot of really awful things happening during this time, but who doesn't love a story where you've got lords and ladies dancing in fancy ballrooms? It's great. So one of the things I really love about this time period, honestly, are the rules. The Regency era, and then even farther into the 1800s when you get into the Victorian era, this English society had a lot of rules, especially, of course, for the ladies. There were a huge variety of things that people could do, couldn't do, what they could wear, what they could say, who they could say it to, all this kind of stuff. And you might think, well, why would you want to constrain yourself with all of these rules that were applicable during this time? Honestly, when you have more rules and you're pushed into this tinier box of what is acceptable and what is not, it makes you be more creative. If you have all of the options in the world, it's easy to pick the easy stuff. It's easy to pick obvious things. But when you're constrained, you have to be more creative with how you tell the story. So I personally really like working within those societal rules that were in place at the time. But more broadly speaking, why do I love reading and writing romance? I actually have an entire video about this on my channel. I'll link that below if you want to go check it out. It's a little bit old, but still accurate. But in short, every romance book, historical romance or otherwise, has a gift within the pages, and it's the gift of hope. Every romance book has a bigger theme of love conquers all, right? Because they all have the happy ending. That's what we're reading for. We want to see how do they get to their happy ending. Love conquers all is the message there, right? So when I'm writing these stories, when I'm writing my books, I'm hoping that one day when they're actually out and available for public consumption, I'm hoping most that these books fall into the hands of readers who need that message. Someone who needs a story where love wins in the end and they can receive that gift of hope for themselves. So maybe you're like, okay, I've got some fun ideas, but I'm not really sure where to start with brainstorming, outlining, getting started on a draft. So let me share a few genre-specific resources for you. The number one resource I would suggest for any romance writer, historical or otherwise, is absolutely Gwen Hayes's Romancing the Beat. This is a beat sheet, similar to Save the Cat, if you're familiar with that. It's an outlining tool, not a rule you have to follow, but a tool to use to help you outline a book or think through. You don't have to be an outliner in order to use this, but it helps you think through different plot points, different things that are going to be expected from readers. And for me, this is the ultimate tool. I love this little beat sheet. It's a very short, quick little book, but it has a huge amount of wisdom in it, and it's written specifically for romance writers. Even if you're not writing a full romance novel, but you have a romance subplot in your story, this book can be really helpful for you in plotting some of those beats. Now, in terms of specifics for historical romance, that gets a little tricky, right? Because like we said, that can encompass a huge number of different time periods. So I'm going to share a few resources that are specific for the Regency era. If you write historical romance or even historical fiction of any kind, and you have different resources that you know of for those different time periods, let us know in the comments. But for the Regency era, I'll give you 3 quick resources here, and then in the description, I'm going to list a whole bunch of other stuff that you can go check out. So I have 2 nonfiction books here, and just a quick note about reading like a nonfiction history book. If that intimidates you, if that's something that you're like, oh, I don't want to read that, you know, and you're thinking of like the history textbook you were forced to read in high school, these are not that. History textbooks for high school, college, university, whatever, are often very dry. They're just giving you the facts. They're not written very engagingly. These, I have found, are written really well. They're very engaging in the way that they tell a story. These authors are telling a story. It's a historic story, but they're telling it really well, in my opinion. And also, you know, if you're interested in a historic time period, reading a book about it is gonna be interesting to you. If you handed me a book about medieval England, I don't really care about medieval England, if I'm being totally honest, and that's going to be a little dry for me to read. hand me a book about the Regency era, I'm going to eat it up because I'm interested in that era. So if your memory of history books is tainted from school days, give it a shot, give it a try, because I think you'll be surprised with what you find here. So first off is Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Adkins. This is just a really great overview of the time period, gives you a general sense of what was going on in the country and out of the country at the time. Highly recommend this one. And another great sort of general overview of the time period is The Regency Years by Robert Morrison. Again, just sort of an overview. There's pictures, which is always super fun. A lot of really great stuff, just really cool. And again, very engaging to read. Now, one of the things you'll often find in Regency or historical romances taking place in that sort of Georgian Victorian era is you've got a lot of dukes and earls and marquises and viscounts and all this kind of stuff, which is fun. That's fun. But of course, not everybody is a duke or an earl or something like that. You have a lot of what they called second sons. So of course, the title goes to the firstborn son. And then if the family continues to have more children, what happens to those other sons that are born? Well, life kind of sucks for them because they don't get a title and they don't get very much in terms of inheritance. And so there's a great book if you want to write about some of those other types of people that were very much present. This is a great one to pick up. It's Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune, because those younger sons had to go and find a way to make a living for themselves. And they were very limited with what they were allowed to do. They couldn't just go be a blacksmith or something. They had to do something respectable, of course, because their dad was an earl or their dad was a duke or whatever. But this has been really interesting just to see how quickly one could go from a really wealthy, well-to-do, titled family to very poor simply because they were born second. Sucks for them, but could make some really fun stories. So again, I'll link those three specifically below in the description, and then I'll put a whole bunch of other stuff down there too that I've found over the years. Before I started writing in this genre, I definitely had some misconceptions about what would be involved in writing this kind of a book. And I think one of the things that has been hilarious to me is the amount of time I spend looking at maps. Where certain places are, how long is it going to take to get from one place to another? Like that takes a lot of my time while I'm writing these books. And then I think a lot of us have watched various movies, TV shows, read books that take place during these times. And I had a lot in mind from watching those shows, and there's a lot of inaccuracies in those shows. Even ones where they really are trying to make it accurate, there's little things that are just wrong. And so a lot of the things I thought I knew about the time period after reading some of these books and looking at different things online, I've realized actually those are very inaccurate. And I'm continuously coming across new information where it's things where you wouldn't even think to Google it or question it. So stuff like I recently found out that in the Regency era, most fireplaces were coal burning. They weren't wood burning. So if you're writing a book set during the Regency and you have a paragraph where they're in a library and there's the crackling fire with the orange glow from the flames of the wood burning fireplace, it almost certainly would not have been that. You have a coal burning fireplace, which is not quite as romantic, but that's what it would have been. So now every time I'm reading a book and they mention their fire burning, their wood burning fireplace, I'm like, no, they didn't. And now I have to go back and change mine. It's kind of annoying, but there's things like that that come up all the time. And now it's hard to watch certain shows or certain movies because I'm like, that's not how it would have been done. They would have had gloves on. The amount of times that people don't have gloves on, okay? We all know the famous hand flicks from the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. They weren't wearing gloves. Why? Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy in that scene should be wearing gloves. But anyway, if you start writing in any historic period, you're going to continuously find new things that make you want to rewrite stuff you've already written, or you're going to be pointing things out in books or other media that you see that is inaccurate. Now let's talk about that just for a second, about inaccuracies when it comes to historical fiction in general, but historical romance too. As the author, you are certainly allowed some creative liberties when it comes to historical accuracy. And as readers, there's going to be different readers who have different standards. And of course, you can't please everybody. There are some authors like Grace Burroughs, Mary Balogh, who really do their research. They really try to make it accurate. There's other authors like Tessa Dare or Sarah MacLean who play a little more fast and loose with the rules. They're not necessarily trying to write a history book for their readers. They're just trying to tell a good story, and if they need to flub some historic details in order to do so, they're going to do it. And that can be totally fine. We're not reading these books to get a lesson. We're getting a story, right? So as a writer, you do need to kind of think about, well, how accurate do I want to be? There are certain things that you can absolutely just sort of gloss over or make up because who cares? For example, I like trying to make things as accurate as possible. So of course I looked up, what is the weather like in 1812 in England? And I found, I'll link it below, I found this huge website that details season by season, like the spring of 1812 was unusually cold and rainy. And that summer was, I don't remember off the top of my head, it was also kind of rainy and not as hot or something like that, And so I like using that in my books to make it accurate. Does anyone else on the planet know what England's weather was like in April of 1812? No. If I had written it as an unusually warm summer, would anybody care? No. So there's stuff like that, like nobody cares. It doesn't matter if you're making it accurate or not. But there's other details that probably do need to be accurate. So for example, if you're writing a book set in 1830 and one of your characters is going off to fight Napoleon, no, he's not, because Napoleon is definitely dead by 1830 and Britain is not engaging in a war with him anymore. So certain details like that, really big historic details, you probably should make sure those are accurate, but otherwise you can kind of flex with it. One of the other big jokes about Regency or Victorian romances is that there are a crazy abundance of dukes in all of these books. Everybody's a duke. There's always a duke, and he also happens to be young, and he also happens to be needing a wife, and also he's super rich, and he's super handsome. What a coincidence, because there was so few, I forget what the number is exactly during this time, but the number of dukes in England in the Regency era, it's like a couple dozen, okay? There's not that many of them. And yeah, in all these books, there's all these, does anyone care though? Do we care? No, we don't. We want to read about the handsome rich duke who needs a wife, okay? Like that's what we're here for. So again, certain details you can kind of flub a little bit. Other things you probably should be researching and making sure it's accurate. So finally, let me give you 2 little pieces of advice if you are wanting to write a historical romance. First, I would highly encourage you to read widely in the historical romance genre, specifically in that whatever time period that you're interested in. There are some authors who really try to preserve the language of the time, the ambiance, the vibes of the time, right? Again, like an author like Mary Balogh has a gorgeous writing style. She doesn't try to sound like Jane Austen, but her language sounds historically. That's a terrible way to describe it, but there it is. Other authors, like I mentioned Sarah MacLean before, she tends to use a lot more modern sounding verbiage. It has a modern flair to it, which is totally fine. She's a very popular author. People love it. There's other authors that kind of straddle the line. I think Lisa Kleypas is maybe one of those where she's not quite full on like historical, but she's got a little bit of historic flair in there. So read widely, figure out what you like to read, and figure out where your writing voice might fit within all of that. My second piece of advice is to do your research. If all you've done for research is reading other historical romance novels, that's not going to cut it. You've got to do your research because there's all kinds of little details, like we said, that are kind of fudged or glossed over or changed a little bit in order to fit the story that author is trying to tell. And if you try to take everything in romance novels as fact, that's going to mess you up. you can't assume that the stuff you're reading in those historical romances is accurate for the period. So I hope that was helpful. If you're embarking on writing a historical romance in 2024, absolutely let me know. I'd love to know what time period you're thinking, what your story is kind of about, maybe a little hint of the tropes that you're going to be using. And I hope you have a good time writing it. Again, please do make sure you check out the rest of the playlist for this collaboration. Thank you again so much to Nicole Wilbur for inviting me to be a part of this. Go check her out. Again, all of the links for all of this will be in the description. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, you can click the subscribe button. I usually post videos on Fridays. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll see you next time. Bye.